Okay, let me share the screen. Okay, everyone. So I mentioned last time how that this is probably the most important chapter of the entire course because everything else that we're going to discuss within American government flows from these very important ideas, right? The separation of powers as well as the checks and balances, right? Which we're gonna take a look at these here within our course. Which, by the way, tomorrow night is also the State of the Union, so we'll talk about a little bit about that, before we end for today. We'll kind of talk about like what that is and the point of that. I mean, we'll talk about it once we get into the executive, the executive branch. We'll definitely talk about that and what that is. Um, but yes, we're going to be talking about, as the Constitution is being ratified, as it's being discussed, and then ultimately ratified, we're going to talk about the major components of the Constitution, right? So first off, of course, I wanted to show you all the separation of powers, right? The idea of separation of powers is extremely important because it's meant as a way to create a system to where you don't have one branch of government in control of everything, right? There's a recurring theme that you should already kind of be aware of when we look at the way our American system of government is set up, right? It's meant to diffuse power as much as possible, to not have one branch, one level, not have any, not have one branch of government, not have one level of government be in control of everything, right? Because we're also going to see that diffusion of power when it comes to the federalist system, which we're going to talk about here a little bit, but also we have a whole chapter that discusses federalism, which is the next chapter, chapter 3. But as you can see here, the idea of separation of powers is where you keep these three branches separate, and they have their own unique duties and responsibilities, right? So if we were to look at the legislative branch, if we were to kind of sum it up in one sentence, like we talked about last time, right? We would think of the legislative branch as passing laws, right? And again, that's the first one right here, passing federal laws. For the executive, we would say that they enforce the laws, right? Whatever the legislature passes, the executive branch has to enforce. For the judicial branch, they decide the constitutionality of laws or they interpret the laws, right? That's another quick way of saying it, right? So, but again, these are not the only things that they are responsible for. As we're going to take a look at here within um, the next part of this chapter, and as I've said before, each of these three branches also has their own specific chapter. We've got the Congress chapter, we've got we've got the presidency chapter, we've got the federal courts chapter. So we're going to go more into detail in those chapters about what all this means, right? And we're going to talk about it really briefly, but we're going to talk about how does the legislature control federal appropriations, basically federal spending. The legislature approves treaties and presidential appointments. This happens here in the Senate. Regulates interstate commerce. We're going to talk about what that means in terms of what this allows for Congress to pass laws dealing with interstate and relationships between the federal government and the states here, right? Establishes lower court systems here, right? That's why we have three levels on the judiciary. It's not just the Supreme Court. We also have the district courts and the circuit courts. For the executive, right? We'll talk about what the commander in chief of armed forces means, basically the president being in charge of the military, engaging in foreign treaties. So the president has a lot of foreign policy initiative and meeting with dignitaries and heads of foreign states here, right? Proposes laws. The president can definitely, as we're going to see tomorrow, the president can propose laws, propose legislation, can call on Congress to work on things, as you're going to see tomorrow night. That's part of what the State of the Union is about. Appoints Supreme Court justices and federal court judges. We're going to talk about that appointment process, the advice and consent. Pardons those convicted in federal court. We'll also talk about what pardoning is and how it can be somewhat controversial, right? And so, of course, with the judicial branch, the constitutionality of laws, of course, is important because this is what we think of when we think of the federal judiciary, that they're supposed to look at laws that are passed by Congress, executive orders enacted by the president, and they're supposed to decide whether they are constitutional or not, right? They're supposed to act as kind of like the referee of our government to ensure that every action that's being taken is constitutional. That is the main role of the judiciary, although, of course, we'll also talk about later on how this was not in the Constitution. This power had to be asserted in the Marbury versus Madison case, which we'll talk about that one a little bit later. reviews lower court decisions, both lower federal courts as well as lower state courts, and decides cases involving disputes between the states here. So, but again, we'll talk more about this not just right now, but also when we get to those chapters here. Okay, so let's kind of scroll back over here really quickly, and let's get to let's start with the legislative. So, um, like we were looking at the Constitution last time, you all saw that the legislative branch is by far in terms of the articles, right? It's by far the longest of the articles, right? It's got 10 sections, as you all saw last time, right? So in Article 1, the Constitution provided for a Congress consisting of two chambers, right? So remember, we've got a bicameral legislature, we've got the House and the Senate. They have different term lengths here, right? So 2 years in the House, 6 years in the Senate. So um, this is interesting, right? Because if you are a member of the House, 2 years is going to go by really quickly. I mean, it's hard to believe that it's already been, it's already been that time since we had the last presidential election, right? It's been over 2 years since President Biden was sworn in, and I vividly remember how that day was. I mean, it's like, it's hard to believe that it's already been 2 years. You all know what I'm talking about, right? 2 years can go by quickly, so it'll already be. I mean, this summer we're already going to have debates for the presidential election. I mean, just it's just insane how fast time goes. So yeah, if you're in the House, 2 years is going to go by like that. So we'll talk about later on how what this does is that this creates a situation where House members are kind of like in what we would call like constant campaigning mode, because they already have to get ready for their reelection efforts. They already have to try to be fundraising money, try to contact donors, and just try to get people to support them. Right? It's a constant situation. Whereas in the Senate, you don't necessarily have to worry about that for a while, right? Because you're not up for reelection for another 6 years. So if you just got reelected here in this past midterm election, you're not gonna. So if you just got reelected in 2022, you don't have to worry about running for reelection until 2028, right? That's when you would next be up for reelection. So that's a pretty good gig, right? Having not having to worry, not having to worry too long about I'm sorry, not having to worry too much about having to seek your reelection. That's not to say that senators don't also campaign and fundraise money. In fact, it gives them a lot more time to fundraise and get more money. So usually senators will have more money saved up than the House members, but it's not something that is like really really pressing, at least for them, so to speak. And then the Senate was designed to guard against excessive democracy. So what this means here is that when the Constitution was originally written, the idea was that senators were not going to be directly elected by the people. Instead, you would have state legislatures that would decide who would be the senator that would represent that state, right? So the way it would work is, if we were still following under the current, under the original guidelines of the Constitution, then we would not be able to vote for Senator Cruz, Senator Cornyn. They would be selected by the members of the Texas legislature, right? The Texas House and the Texas Senate. They would be the ones who would vote on who the senator for from Texas that would go and represent Texas in the U.S. Senate. They would decide who would represent them. This is why, I don't know if y'all remember from history. I don't know if y'all remember the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. Back when Lincoln was running for Douglas's Senate seat, and that was one of the most famous debates in American history. But the interesting thing about those debates that a lot of people don't know is that yes, they were going out and debating across Illinois, and a lot of people were showing up, but those people really didn't have a direct impact on that election, because it was going to be up to the Illinois state legislature to decide who the senators would be. Of course, there's other important reasons as to why they were going up, and doing those debates in public. But the point is that they could have just had those debates there in the Illinois State House, and that would have been that, right? Because those are the actual people who were going to vote and voted for Douglas instead of Lincoln. Although Lincoln had the last laugh when he then defeated Douglas for president later on. But yeah, so originally that's the way the system was set up, to where and again, and that's what we're talking about, guarding against excessive democracy, right? Where you only had the people voting for the House members and not the Senate. And there's some logic behind this. And again, people have different viewpoints and opinions about this. But the idea was that the a lot of the framers did not trust the average person to make the so-called educated or right decision, right? Because back then, very few people went to college, very few people were college educated, and again, and the framers, I get where they're coming from, right? I have different opinions about how I feel about that process, but in terms of, do I understand where they were coming from? Yes, absolutely, because this was a new experiment in democracy. Democracy had not been experimented on this vast a scale before. Yes, we had democracy with the city states, with the ancient Greeks and all that, but it had never been tried on this vast a scale before, right? With millions of people and having a government that was ultimately going to be run by the people, right? Not having a not having a not having an aristocracy, right? Because again, they fought that Revolutionary War to get away from aristocracy, right? So they wanted to do something different. So they had to kind of put. I like to call it like they had to put like training wheels on democracy, right? We had to kind of not give the people too much of this power. We have to kind of educate them, guide them, so to speak, kind of build up the rule of law, build up these democratic institutions to where, we're going to have a strong judiciary, and then we're going to have that strong rule of law. And so we do see later on that the United States, of course, has given more direct power to the people because we had the 17th Amendment, which undid the senators being only elected by the state legislatures. Now we can vote for our senators, right? We've also seen this with the primary system, where instead of the political parties choosing candidates for president, we can choose those candidates, right? So we've seen in American history that as we've gotten better at democracy, gotten more. Um, we have gotten more, I guess you could say, more of that excessive democracy, right? Where we've gotten, more an ability to get involved in our democracy. But you have to understand where they're coming from, right? In terms of, sorry, all these people are messaging me. We have to look at this in terms of, there's a lot that could go wrong, right? Because they're trying it out, it's brand new. Again, just like I talked about with the training wheels, right? The idea of putting the training wheels, in case you fall, it's not going to be as bad as, if you don't have the training wheels, right? So, but again, so this is what we're talking about in terms of excessive democracy, which we're going to mention this again when we talk about the Federalists and Anti-Federalists here. The Senate alone was given power to ratify treaties and approve presidential appointments. So this is also important in that the House and the Senate have their own specific roles. So the House is given the sole power to originate revenue bills, right? So any bill having to do with money, funding, the budget, it has to start in the House. The impeachment process also starts in the House, right? The impeachment is the impeachment process, which we'll talk about a little bit later on in the class. That also has to start in the House, right? The ability for Congress to remove a high-ranking federal official. Everyone thinks of the president, right? But the president is not the only person that is subjected to the impeachment power. But yes, when it comes to impeachment, it has to start in the House, and then it gets to the Senate, where they actually have the trial, so to speak. And then this one over here, the Senate has a lot of administrative power, where the Senate is the entity that ratifies treaties that the United States can engage into. More so, this second one is what we see more than treaties, because treaties don't happen all the time. But every time a new president is sworn in, a president has to have a cabinet, right? A president has to have those closest advisors. The president um, also appoints ambassadors. These high-ranking officials. That deal with foreign policy. From time to time, presidents also have to appoint Supreme Court justices, and presidents always are appointing federal judges at the district and even at the circuit level. So the approval of the presidential appointments, an appointment is basically hiring, right? So the president gets to hire, people to work within the federal, the federal government, but they have to be approved by the Senate. So if the president's going to appoint someone, they can't just start serving in their position right away. They have to get basically they have to get they have to get approved, right? It's called advising consent, and we'll talk about that process a little bit later on, like especially when it comes to the Supreme Court judges, where they have to go to the Senate Judiciary Committee, and then they have to answer questions, and then they have to get voted out of the committee. If they get approved by the committee, then they go to the full Senate floor to be voted upon, and then there's all this debate and all that stuff. So, but again, but the idea is that the Senate and the House have their own unique, specific responsibilities here. So, So yeah, let's continue talking about express powers and implied powers. Okay, so the express powers are the ones we looked at last time, right? These are the specific powers that are granted by the Constitution to Congress and the President, right? This is what's actually written in the Constitution. This is what is outlined within the Constitution, right? So very straightforward in terms of what express powers are. It's what's in the Constitution. Now, implied powers. This is this is what is not necessarily written in the Constitution. These are, and it defines itself, right? Expressed, it's being expressed within the writings of the Constitution. Implied means that it's inferred due to what we see in the express power. So this is also known as the necessary and proper clause or the elastic clause. It provides Congress with the authority to make all laws that are necessary and proper to carry out its enumerated power. So when people talk about the United States Constitution, our federal Constitution, and people talk about how that it's short, it's broad, it doesn't have a lot of specifics, there's a reason for that. There's a reason why it's not lengthy like the Texas Constitution. It's because it allows for this flexibility, for this elasticity. Because the point of having a constitution that doesn't have a lot of specifics is that it gives the government, the levels of government, it gives the branches, excuse me, it gives them considerable leeway in terms of their job and how they go about doing their job. So with Congress, let's give an example. If we go to if we continue here, and then we'll come back to the elastic clause here and what this means. I just wanted to give you all some examples, and then we'll tie it back to what we're talking about here. So Section 8, we also looked at that last time. We looked at how this is basically Congress's job description. This is what Congress is supposed to do. This is what they're tasked with. So the Section 8 of Article 1, the elastic clause, allows Congress to collect taxes, borrow money, regulate commerce, declare war, maintain an army and a navy, right? So if you all remember from what we looked at here, let me see. Let me see if I can open it up again. Hold on. Let me see if I can open it up. Yeah, let me do that really quick. Hold on. Let me open it up again so that way we can kind of reference here. That's a pretty good idea. Let me open it up again really quickly, and then that way you all can kind of see what I'm talking about in a better visual light here. So let me open up the Constitution again, and then we'll kind of compare here a bit. All right, let me scroll down here really quickly. Let's see. Okay, let's get to the. Okay, all right. Okay, let me share the screen again. Okay, all right. Okay, so this is section 8 here, right? Y'all can see it, right? Okay, yeah. So this is section 8 right here. So um, we talked about this last time, right? We talked about how these are this is Congress's job description. This is what Congress is responsible for doing, right? But have you noticed that for several of these, they're kind of brief, right? To borrow money on the credit of the United States, to establish post offices, to provide and maintain a navy. Notice how some of these are very short and they don't really give a lot of specifics. Okay, so how does Congress maintain a navy? How do they set it up? What is the navy going to look like? That's not mentioned in the Constitution. And again, there's a reason for this, right? Because it's brief, it gives Congress the flexibility to decide how they're going to do this, how they're going to maintain the Navy. What is the Navy going to look like? When it comes to establishing a uniform rule of naturalization, it doesn't say how to determine immigration. It doesn't say what we're going to focus on when it comes to immigration. Are we going to focus more on a merit-based system where you get approved because of superior work skills and education and intellect, or are we going to focus more on a family system where if you already have people living here, then your immediate relatives can also come over to the United States? It doesn't say that here, right? Because this is Congress's job to decide how they're going to determine what naturalization is going to be, right? So does this kind of make sense in terms of when we talk about the Constitution, being open to interpretation, having that flexibility, so to speak? Does that kind of make sense in terms of what we're talking about, right? That's why it's called the elastic clause, right? The necessary and proper clause, right? That if we go back here, that because the Constitution only has a brief outline in terms of how Congress does this. Congress fills in the gaps. They decide how they're going to adhere to these Section 8 powers, how they're going to collect the taxes. Tax season is coming up, right? And everyone is. I mean, I used to like it because I used to be able to get refunds every year, but I haven't gotten a refund ever since I started making a lot more money. So now I'm not really looking forward to it because I'm going to have to pay probably. But a great example of this is, Congress is responsible for collecting taxes, but it's not Congress who actually is collecting the taxes. They can hand that off to the IRS, and then they collect the money for them, right? That's another example of how, as long as the job's getting done, then that's okay, so to speak, right? So it does allow for that flexibility. Let me see. I know there was another comment here in the chat. Okay, yes, okay, yes, exactly. So yeah, and the executive branch also falls under the elastic clause as well, right? The necessary and proper, because Article 2 is even shorter than Article 1, and again, it doesn't really give too many specifics here in terms of how the president is going to do their job here, right? The Constitution provided for establishment of the presidency in Article 2. Executive branch powers, of course, the president can negotiate treaties with approval of the Senate. This is why later on, when we get to the executive branch, we're going to see that presidents don't necessarily engage in treaties too often anymore. Instead, they engage in executive agreements, and there's different types of executive agreements. There's like unilateral ones where the president doesn't need approval from Congress, and then there's some where they just need a simple majority instead of a 2/3 vote. So there's different ways that they can still achieve the same type of foreign agreements with other countries. It's just that if it's an official treaty, it's more strict in terms of what you have to do. So that's why nowadays presidents engage more in these executive agreements where they just negotiate it. They just negotiate it on their own with the presidents or prime ministers or foreign heads of state, so to speak, right? But again, we'll talk more about this when we get to the presidency chapter, right? The president can grant reprieves and pardons. This, of course, is one of the more controversial powers that the president has because, again, this also is done unilaterally where the president doesn't have to get approval from Congress to have a pardon or a reprieve, a commutation. There's all different. They're pretty much the same thing, but there are a few slight differences, and we'll talk more about what all those mean when we get to the presidency chapter here. But the idea is just that if the president pardons you, then you basically get forgiven for your federal crime, so to speak, right? And we'll talk about some of these really controversial pardons, like President Ford pardoning his former boss, Richard Nixon, and the Watergate scandal and things like that. So, but again, that's also why it tends to be rather controversial because it's final and it doesn't need any approval from anybody else. The president appoints major departmental personnel, as we kind of talked about here. This, of course, is where the president appoints members of the cabinet, right? All those different secretaries, which you're probably familiar with, right? Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Energy Secretary, Secretary of Labor, Secretary of Education. There's all kinds of them, right? The president is the one who makes those appointments. Those are not elected. Those are hired by the president here. The president can veto congressional enactments. We'll talk about that when we get to the lawmaking process here within the legislative chapter. That the president and that's also very interesting as well, everyone. That especially when we look at the lawmaking process, requires all three branches of government to be involved in some way, shape, or form, right? That Congress can't get a law to be passed unless the president, signs it, right? Now you can override the veto, but you need a 2/3 vote on that. And then, of course, the judiciary also gets involved because they have to make sure that the law is constitutional. So they're involved not in a direct sense, but they have, but laws they do have to be constitutional, right? Or else they won't stand here. And the president can convene Congress to a special session. This of course happens, when usually during times of emergency, like I know, like after 9/11 happened, former President Bush, he called Congress to a special session to, basically, get the Congress's approval for military action in Afghanistan, right? The war in Afghanistan. And then we also saw that with after Pearl Harbor, right, where FDR gave his famous, speech, the day that will live in infamy. He was before Congress because he was trying to get a declaration of war on Japan, right? So, so the president can call Congress into the special sessions. You could also make an argument that tomorrow is also kind of like a special session, even though it is a requirement. And let me also explain a little bit in terms of why it's a requirement. So we talked about this last time. I remember we talked about how that in the Constitution there is the provision where the president has to give an update on the status of the country, the state of the union, so to speak. And I mentioned before that it used to be just like a written report that the president had to give to Congress. But now, in more recent years, it's morphed into an event, right, where the president actually goes to Congress and actually speaks to Congress and to the nation, right? So you could consider it, yeah, like kind of like a special session where they do go and the president, does speak before Congress, right? So yeah, so it is. So these are just a broad overview of the executive branch powers, and then the judicial branch powers. The Constitution provided for the establishment of the judicial branch in Article 3. The judicial branch includes the Supreme Court of the United States, but as we've mentioned, this is not the only level of federal courts. We also have the district courts and the circuit courts. Those are 3 levels. Congress could add more levels, as well as also could add. Uh, they could also add more numbers of judges on the Supreme Court. So right now we're at 9 judges, but that's not a that's not a static number, right? That we've seen throughout American history where the Supreme Court has expanded, it's contracted. The number of judges can change. So that is a power that Congress has here, right? They can also create more levels of judges as well, right? They could add more judges. So this is a power that Congress has, right? So ultimately, of course, the federal judiciary, what their main responsibility, like we said, is to interpret the Constitution, as well as the power to resolve conflicts between federal and state laws, which this happens quite a bit. Where you have situations, and we're going to look at some of these famous Supreme Court cases, right? Like Brown versus Board of Education is a fantastic example of differing especially the aftermath of what happened, right? Where the Supreme Court can make a decision that then becomes binding case law, right? So this is why when we talk about the Supreme Court, one of the questions I always like to ask everyone is, why should we pay attention to the Supreme Court? Why does everybody like stop what they're doing whenever there's a new Supreme Court decision? Like you all remember last summer, right, where we had the Hobbs case. No, it was Hobbs or Dobbs. So it was one of the case that overturned Roe versus Wade, right? You all remember that from last summer, right? And you all remember that there was a lot of controversy. A lot of people were making a big deal about it. Let me ask you all this question really quickly. Why is that such a big deal? Why is it such a big deal that we have to pay attention to these Supreme Court cases? Does anyone have an idea why that is an issue here? Like why we have to kind of pay attention to the Supreme Court? It sets precedent. Yes, exactly. You're right. Yes, the Supreme Court does have the ability to set that precedent, which then becomes binding case law, right? So right now, there's no law that right now that there's no law on the books in Congress when it comes to abortion, right? That was something that was overturned by the Supreme Court, right? And so the Supreme Court has the ability to create case law that then becomes the law of the land, right? We also saw this a few years earlier with the Obergefell v. Hodges decision. This, of course, was the gay marriage issue, right? That's why we have marriage equality now in the United States, thanks to the Supreme Court decision in Obergefell v. Hodges, right? In fact, the picture at the beginning of this chapter is from that case here, right? So yes, exactly. You're exactly right. That is why we have to pay attention to the Supreme Court, because they can set that precedent, and then that becomes case law, right? So yeah, and we do see this where there are conflicts between the federal and the state laws, where you'll have and this happens like more often than you think, right? You'll have like situations where like the state of Texas will sue the federal government, usually when it has to do with like border security, things like that. And so then federal courts have to step in. You've also probably seen news articles where federal judges will block certain things. Like there'll be an article where it'll say like this federal judge has blocked this initiative, right? They have the ability to do that, right? Where they can issue these injunctions. And I know we're kind of getting into some legal terminology here, but basically the point is that they can basically say, you know what, we're going to block this because it needs to be reviewed, right? We need to review this practice, so we're going to temporarily halt it so that it can go through the court system, and then we can get a resolution on this, right? So this is where you'll have situations where the federal judges will step in, after someone, of course, has filed a lawsuit or things like that, and then the judge can provide one of these emergency stays, so to speak, right? But again, we're kind of getting more into like legal terminology here. Has jurisdiction over citizen controversies for different states. So this is also where you have situations where you've got lawsuits involving people from different states. The federal courts can also step in, right? Because they can. Let's see, was there a comment here? Oh, okay, I thought that was a comment. They can also step in and provide disagreement. They can step in and try to resolve disagreements. Remember, I talked about how, um, let's say if you got a business in Texas, but you're doing business with someone in New Mexico, right? And so you have a dispute, right? Well, which law are you going to follow, right? Are you going to follow New Mexico law or Texas law? The federal courts can step in and act as kind of like a fair arbiter, so to speak, where it's not a conflict of interest, in terms of following one state law when the other person is from another state. The federal government can kind of step in whenever you have these differences between people from different states. The judges are also given lifetime appointments, so this is also why these judiciary appointments tend to be rather contentious. We will talk about this, later on in the class. How like again, there's good videos in the additional resources that show you all how some of these hearings go, where um, they'll ask them questions about how they feel about certain cases. I know with the most recent judicial appointees from the Trump administration, you had Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett. Those were the three judges that Trump was able to get on the Supreme Court. A lot of the Democrats on the Senate Judiciary Committee were asking questions about, Roe versus Wade and the constitutionality of it, because they were concerned that these judges might have tried to overturn Roe versus Wade, and it turns out, it turns out they're the one that, yeah, exactly. So they had their reasons for why they were asking those questions, right? And of course, as we saw, that their concerns, turned out we see why they were asking those questions, right? Exactly. So I want for you all to understand, um, well, yeah, that's another thing, right? In terms of right. I've heard that as well, right? In terms of right. I've heard members of Congress have said that, right? They have said that they felt that their answers that they were given during the judiciary committees, they had some issues with those answers, right? They didn't feel that maybe they were quite as truthful as they should have, right? It's definitely something that we'll see if anything happens with that. I know there was a lot of consternation last year when it came out, but yeah, no, yeah, that's definitely, yeah, that definitely is something that I've heard a lot of people say, right? In terms of, and again, and it goes back to what I'm saying, right? That there's a reason why they were asking those questions, because that was their concern, that was their fear, that they felt that maybe these judges, like you said, that they were going to be conservative and possibly overturn Roe versus Wade. And of course, as you all can look it up as well, that those three judges were on the six to the three decision, on the side of the six to um, overturn Roe versus Wade, right? So that's important, because those committee hearings are extremely important, because that's why they ask those questions, for that reason here. But again, we'll talk more about that when we get to the judiciary chapter here. So okay, so does this make sense? Again, this is just a very brief overview of the three branches. This does not give them justice, right? We are going to go more into detail on what these three branches do within their own specific chapters. Other points here? Let's see. Are there other points? Yes, makes sense. Okay, sounds good. Okay, let's go ahead and continue. Which, by the way, very, very good points. I'm glad that very good points. I'm glad that you're keeping up with all of this, and thank you for sharing your thoughts on this. Yes, absolutely. That this is definitely something that a lot of people have very strong opinions about. So I'm glad that you were comfortable enough to share your opinions as well here. Okay, so anyway, so let's continue here. So national power, national unity and power. So the U.S. Constitution unifies the nation with a common economy. So you also have to remember, everyone, this is another major objective that the framers were needing to accomplish here was that they were trying to unite the nation because under the Articles of Confederation, remember we talked about this last week that the states weren't really united with each other, right? I mean, they definitely were during the American Revolution, but then once they had their independence, they kind of went back to kind of just doing their own thing, just having the states kind of be like 13 different countries, so to speak. And so the Constitution was meant as a way to unite the states, right? To actually make them the United States, right? To unite them under a common economy and under this ability for the federal government to step in whenever there's disagreements amongst the states, right? So states were prohibited from discriminating against other states' goods or citizens. We'll talk more about this in chapter 3. The full faith and credit clause, privileges and immunities. We'll talk about that in chapter 3 here. But to begin with, what we do need to talk about here is that the federal government ultimately has the power over when it comes to state laws through the supremacy clause, right? So the U.S. Constitution stands supreme over state laws as specified in the supremacy clause found in Article 6 of the Constitution. The supremacy clause also binds all state and local as well as federal officials to take an oath to support the national constitution, right? So even though, as we're going to talk about next in the next chapter with federalism, right? Even though the states do have a great deal of independence from the federal government, that doesn't mean that the federal government doesn't have influence over the states, especially when it comes to constitutional disagreements, right? So what the supremacy clause is basically meaning is that whenever there is a conflict with a state law and what the Constitution is saying, that the Constitution is going to win out because the U.S. Constitution is the Constitution that all the 50 states have to adhere to, right? Any state law, any amendment to the state constitution has to be constitutional, right? You can't have a situation where, like, if let's say after the Civil War, states want, the Confederate States still wanted to keep slavery. No, obviously, of course, that would be not allowed because that violates the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery, right? So you can't have a state law or anything like that that would do that because obviously, of course, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, right? So that's an example of the supremacy clause where whenever there's a conflict between the U.S. Constitution and state local laws, you can't have that, right? That's why any local ordinance, any state law, it has to be constitutional according to the U.S. Constitution. I mean, it has to be constitutional with their own state constitution, but their state constitution also has to abide by the U.S. Constitution. You can't have violations of the U.S. Constitution in these state constitutions because the U.S. Constitution is the basis for the state constitution and even local city ordinances because they're all supposed to be united under the United States, right? You don't have 50 different countries, right? You have that strengthening of the federal power here, right? So the Constitution established procedures for its own revision in Article 5. Basically talking about how that you need a 2/3 of this. You need a 2/3 vote in Congress, and then you need 3/4 of the states to vote on amending the Constitution. This is why there's only been 17 amendments since 1791. Yes, we have 27 amendments, but we're going to talk about later on in chapter 4 how the Bill of Rights were basically kind of tacked on, as part of the event, the ratification process. So if we don't count the Bill of Rights, it's only happened 17 times in the last 200 and almost 250 years. Yeah, almost 250 years, right? So again, those requirements, of course, like I mentioned, right? You need a 2/3 vote in both houses of Congress, and then you need three-fourths of the states to agree with it. Good luck getting 3/4 of the states to agree on anything, especially with the way things are so bitterly divided today. You're not going to get three-fourths. You might not even get 3/4 of the states to agree that the sky is blue. They might vote against it just because it's a Democrat Congress, so the Republican states are going to say no. Like, we're not going to. I don't know. It's that divided. It's really that divided. So, which we'll talk more about that as we progress through the class. If you're not aware of it, yeah, the country is pretty divided right now. The Constitution also lays out the rules for its ratification or adoption in Article 7, right? So again, like I said, Constitution required 9 of the 13 states because this is 3/4 of the states at the time, right? So 9 of the 13 is 3/4 back then. Now, again, since we have a lot more states, now it would be, you would need 30-something states in order to actually, vote to actually ratify the amendment of the Constitution, and ultimately the ratification of the Constitution to begin with, right? So even if all 13 states did not ratify, it would take effect for all 13 once the threshold of 9 states, right? So this is talking about how that even if you had like several states that did, and there were some states that didn't ratify it at all, but they were going to come under its power once you got the 9 needed, right? So once they finally got 9 states to agree to this, then the Constitution would be ratified, and that's why once we get towards the end of this chapter, we do have to talk about the ratification process and how it was very important, right? Because you needed to try to convince the states to you needed to try to get 9 out of 13 states to actually agree to this, right? So again, so we talked about this here. So let's discuss what we talked about, right? The Constitution includes the 2 key principles: separation of powers and federalism. As I mentioned before, separation of powers is not explicitly stated, but is maintained by the checks and balances system, which we'll talk about here right now. Some examples of those checks and balances. And then federalism, of course, was devised as a system of 2 sovereigns, the states and the nation, in the hope that competition between them would limit the power of each. So federalism, as we're going to talk about in the next chapter, was meant as a way to kind of keep both sides at bay, so to speak, right? Not have the states take too much power, but also not have the federal government take too much power, right? You kind of wanted to meet in the middle, so to speak, right? To kind of balance it out, like on a scale, right? Kind of balance out that power where the states have about as equal power as the federal government, and so that's where the framers, when they came up with the with how to equally balance out the weight of government, that's what they did here in terms of trying to create a system where you wouldn't have one level having a lot more power than the other, right? Because under the articles, the states had pretty much all the power, and the federal government didn't have much of any. So they had to increase the power of the federal government, but not to the point where then it would be lopsided the other way, right? Where the states wouldn't have any power and the federal government would have too much power. So they kind of had to meet in the middle, right? And the Bill of Rights, or list of citizens' rights, are the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, which again, chapter 4 will discuss the Bill of Rights here. So okay, so the checks and balances. You probably have heard of this concept before here, everyone. This is also extremely important because what you definitely all need to know about the checks and balances is that this is a way to ensure that there's not one branch that's more powerful than the other, right? And again, you don't necessarily have to memorize all of these, but I want for you all to be familiar with this idea, right? That you have an ability for each branch to check each other in different ways, right? I mean, an example of a check where all 3 are involved is the nomination of the Supreme Court justices, right? Because that is a check on the judicial branch, right? Where the executive branch can decide who serves on the judiciary, but the legislature also gets involved because they can also check the executive, because they can also say, well, we're not going to approve of who you appointed to go here. We can also say, you know what, we're not going to approve, this particular judge. Let's see, one branch is not more powerful than the other, yet the parties tried it. Yes, it's right. It's a situation where that's why elections are extremely important, right? Because as we saw with this recent midterm election, now we see that the House is controlled by the Republicans. So now they're going to try to enact their agenda, but then they have issues because the Democrats are still in control of the Senate, right? So how much can they actually get accomplished if you have divided government, right? I mean, that's right. And we'll also see, and yes, and that's also a good point in terms of, the makeup of the Supreme Court, right? And how, those presidential elections are extremely important, right? That's why the Republicans definitely were trying their best, even though maybe initially they weren't really fans of Trump. They were, once he was a nominee, they definitely needed to rally around him and try to get him elected so that they could try to get those Supreme Court judges, on the they're on the Supreme Court. And of course, like we talked about a little while ago, we saw what would be the effects of that, so to speak, right? So but yes, and so we can see that there's all kinds of them, right? There's all kinds of checks and balances here, such as vetoing an act of Congress, a check the executive has on the legislature, right? Override the presidential veto, right? So this is how the legislature can get back at the executive, right? Impeach and remove the president. This is a check that the legislature has on the executive, right? Another check that the legislature has on the judicial is can change the size of the federal court system, right? And then the declaring unconstitutional actions, right? This can be done either to the executive or to the legislature, right? Because you can make an argument that the main job of the judiciary is to check these 2, right? that's their main job, is to provide checks, because that's what they do, right? They check to make sure that the laws that are passed by Congress or the executive orders made by the president, that they are constitutional, right? So in a way, the main role of the judiciary is to check the other two, right? So it's kind of interesting, right? That's basically what their main job is, right? So again, you don't necessarily have to know all of these, but just be familiar with why we have them and why they're so important, and kind of be familiar with like a couple of examples. But so does this kind of make sense in terms of why checks and balances are extremely important, everyone? Does this kind of make sense, or not really? Does this kind of make sense? Does it make sense? Okay, sounds good. Okay, very good. Okay, so we don't have too much time. Let's kind of go through the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and then we'll kind of finish up here really quickly before we leave for today. Okay, so let's kind of delve a little bit back into American political history here. So the struggle for ratification included 13 separate campaigns, right? Because remember, we had to go to 13 different states to try to get them, to at least try to get 9 of them to be ratified, right? Now, let's also talk a little bit about the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Now, the Federalists, they were tasked with this responsibility to try to make the change to our system of government, right? Because originally we had tried it under the anti-federalist viewpoint, right? The anti-federalists favored the balance of power resting with the states and divided over alternatives of the Constitution, right? So the anti-federalists, a lot of them, they liked how the articles were to begin with, right? They favored the states having more of the power. But of course, we saw that we had tried it that way, and we saw that the states had a little bit too much power, and the federal government didn't have much of any. So the Federalists came in and they said, okay, we need a stronger central government because we tried it the way you all did, and so we need to try something different. And so they supported the Constitution because they felt that, obviously, of course, we need to have a stronger central government. The Anti-Federalists, of course, answered back and they said, well, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Let's we don't want a complete 180 to where now the federal government has all the power, right? States are still important, and states still need to have, a lot of power within our system of government, right? So this is where they were trying to get into that balancing act, right? Where, again, we don't want to take, we do need to expand the power of the federal government, but not at the expense of the states, I guess is a good way to say it, right? Not at the expense of the states, not to leave the states behind without power here. So, again, this is a list of who, who the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, tended to be, not just in terms of the names of the founders of the Constitution, but also their backgrounds, right? So the Federalists, these tended to be more the wealthier people, right? Property owners, merchants. The Anti-Federalists tended to be more the lower class, right? So the upper class, they were more the Federalists. The Anti-Federalists were more lower class, right? These are probably the people that are less likely to be college educated, right? These are more of your everyday, your everyday workers, right? Your laborers, right? Your shopkeepers, your blacksmiths, right? Small farmers, not the big plantation owners, right? So the Federalists, they believed in stronger national government and catering to the elites because they felt that the elites were more qualified. They felt that the elites knew more what they were doing. They were more highly educated. The fact that they were wealthy said something about their ability to succeed in life. Whereas again, the Anti-Federalists were more so, more the everyday person, So the Federalists believed that the elites should, they should have more control over government because they didn't trust the common person, like we mentioned earlier. But the Anti-Federalists still felt that it was important to have more participation, right? That every person, every common person, should also get involved in government, right? And again, and I've said before that I've got different opinions about all this, in terms of like where I see they're coming. By those standards, I'm the Anti-Federalist. I have strong opinions of elites or wealthy people being in power having to be. But honestly, I agree with you. In terms of how I kind of see this. Again, as I was saying earlier, I do see where the Federalists were coming from, but at the same time, I also agree with what you're saying, right? That I'm the type of person that I want for more participation, even if I don't agree with other people, even if I don't necessarily agree with, and we'll talk about this when we get to the voting chapter, right? Because a lot of people will have their reasons for why they vote, and it's not for me to decide whether that's a valid reason. I'm of the camp that I'm just thankful that people are voting, right? Because we have such low voter turnout. Um, if I see people who are voting and maybe I might not necessarily agree with them, that's good because I want for more people to get involved. I want for people to care about what's going on, even if I don't necessarily agree with it. So, yeah, I do. But again, at the same time, I also understand where the Federalists were coming from because, again, they were afraid of a situation where, remember we talked about it, earlier in the chapter, how you had some of these states that were going to, um, tax the wealthier at higher rates and things like that. I mean, which again, there's different opinions about that. But the point is that the Federalists felt that they felt that the rule of law was not strong enough to have so many of these these people who might not necessarily know the intricacies of government getting involved, which again, I get where they're coming from. What we do see now, as I was saying earlier, is that we do see the anti-federalists having more of an influence, right? Where now we do see more of that direct democracy, right? Like I mentioned, with the senators being directly elected. Um, we've seen the expansion of voting, right? When we get to the voting chapter, you're going to see that voting was pretty much a privilege, right? It was left up to white male property owners. But of course, we've seen that that throughout American history, we've seen that also has changed, right? To where now we don't have the property requirements, right? It's not based on gender, it's not based on race. As long as you are 18 years old and you're a citizen and you're not in any type of legal trouble, you can have the right to vote, right? So we have expanded, eligibility for voting. So you're right. So we can make an argument that the Anti-Federalists have made a lot of strides in terms of not just having certain people vote, but allowing for more people to vote, right? So yes, I definitely, when it comes to that, I definitely do tend to look at it more like the Anti-Federalist perspective, where I'm just thankful that people are voting, even if, let's say I might let's say if like somebody tells me why they voted and I might not feel that that's a good enough reason, that's not for me to decide, right? That's for them to decide. Their right to vote is just as valid as my right to vote is. Even if maybe they might not necessarily be voting for how I would vote. Again, that's their right. Your right to vote is your right to vote, and it's not it necessarily. I don't feel that it should be based, simply on like an intelligence test. I mean, we used to have that, right? We used to have like the literacy test and all that stuff. So, but anyway, I'm kind of going off track here. But yes, I just wanted to kind of add to what Elda is saying, right? In terms of the, kind of like how we could perceive this, right? But again, I do understand where the Federalists were also coming from, right? In fact, I agree with things on both ends, right? I did agree that the federal government did need to expand more because it was just not workable, right, in terms of the way the articles were set up. But at the same time, I also didn't want for a lot of people to be shut out of the political process, right? So, but anyway, it is what it is. So both sides presented essays, speeches, pamphlets, and that's the great thing about this debate, everyone, right? Is that this is a debate that's still going on to this day, right? You still have Federalists. I mean, we don't call them Federalists and Anti-Federalists anymore, but you still have people on one side that are for stronger central government, and other people are for limited, more states' rights government. It's a debate that's still going on even to this day, right? Both sides presented these essays, speeches, pamphlets, and letters for and against ratification of the Constitution. The Federalist Papers, very important, very important documents. I actually have, I mean, not the original ones, but I've got reproduction copies here in my house and in my office. The Federalist Papers are fantastic, in my opinion. They talk about, they're kind of like the cliff notes of, or not, no, not necessarily cliff notes. I guess you could say cliff notes, but they're more like I guess you could say cliff notes, right? Like of a book. Like, I don't know if any of you have read Cliff Notes, where it gives extra insight into the book. I guess you could also say it's kind of like the special features of a movie, so to speak, where you kind of look behind the scenes at how a movie's being produced. This is how I would like to describe the Federalist Papers. These are documents that describe what the Constitution is about, what was the logic behind the Constitution, why it was written the way it was. Um, and so these were written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. So the Anti-Federalists argued that the new Constitution betrayed, the revolution and would lead back to a monarchy, right? We kind of saw, some of that with the Shays Rebellion, right? So Anti-Federalists included Patrick Henry and Richard Henry Lee. So the Federalists, these are the more liberals, the more progressives, and then the Anti-Federalists were your more conservatives, right? So um, the Anti-Federalists wanted representatives who were a true picture of the people, right? They argued this could only be achieved in small republics such as the existing states, right? So they wanted the Anti-Federalists wanted more representation, right? They wanted a true picture of the people, right? Because not everyone is wealthy, right? But the Federalists argued that the advantages of representative government included people choosing individuals with experience and talent to represent them, right? So again, the Federalists were making the argument that we need to have more qualified people get involved in government. Now, again, as I've said before, I get where they're coming from, because the country is in its infancy. There's a lot that could go wrong. Um, but as I've said before, we've seen that as the country has progressed, we have seen that this true picture of the people is starting to get more. We start to see it more, when it comes to like voting and representation. Now in Congress we tend to see more women in Congress, right, than before, more minorities. Now there's other problems when it comes to the funding of elections and all that stuff, which we'll talk about that later on. But we have seen that this true picture of the people is starting to be a little bit more realized. Maybe not quite at what it should be, but we are starting to see it more realized here, right? Okay, so both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists feared tyranny or the unjust use of power and authority by the government. The Anti-Federalists were concerned the government would be controlled by the wealthy elite, feared the tyranny of a few over the many, and the Federalists feared tyranny of the many over the few, right? Feared a popular majority would trample on the rules of justice. So again, both of these sides have very strong arguments. I think you all can definitely see where both of them are coming from, right? I mean, and also it just depends on what you feel is more tyrannical, right? Do you feel that having a few wealthy people control everything, is that more tyrannical, or having everybody be in control of everything, but maybe they're not quite as smart, be tyrannical? Again, it depends on how you see this, right? As I said before, I kind of have like a mixed view of this, where, like I said, I get where they're coming from to start off, but then as you learn to ride your democracy bike a lot more, then you can kind of take the training wheels off and allow for people to have more direct control, right? That's also why we're seeing movements to try to do away with the electoral college, right? There's been a lot of talk about that. Do we even need it anymore, right? Maybe at first we might have needed it, but is it something that we still need to this day, right? And we'll talk about that when we get to the election chapter here. But again, so very, very good points. And then obviously, of course, the idea of limited government power. The Anti-Federalists wanted a weak central government with enumerated powers and a Bill of Rights, which ultimately they won out here. We'll talk about the 10th Amendment of the Constitution and how that was that's the reserved that basically that's the Reserved Powers Amendment, which basically deals with states' rights. And the Federalists saw a need for strong central government and divided governmental powers to prevent a tyranny of the majority here, as we saw with the Senate being an example of this here, with the direct election of, I'm sorry, not the direct election of senators by the people, but by the state legislatures. Okay, let's see. Okay, last thing we'll cover really quickly is the amendment process. So the U.S. Constitution provides for amendments or changes in Article 5, as we mentioned here. Let's just kind of talk about this here really quickly. Passage of 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate, then ratification by 3/4 of the states. This is the most common one. We also see there's also this process is basically the same. It's just that they have a different they have a few different ways to get to the 3/4 of the states, either by having the actual people of the states vote for it, or they actually have conventions where the elected officials of the state decide for it. But basically it's the same thing, right? Where you need you need the 2/3 vote in in the House and Senate. And then of course you also have the national conventions called by Congress. So again, there's a few different ways to do this, but the main idea is that you need at least 3/4 of the states to buy into this, right? And this explains why there has not been too many amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Like I said, only 17 in the last 250 years or so. Okay, let's go ahead and end for today. So that's pretty much all that we needed to cover here. So we had a very good conversation today. I'm glad that we discussed some really good things about the U.S. Constitution, and there's still a lot of debate even to this day, right, in terms of how our Constitution is set up and how different groups have different viewpoints on it, different interpretations. It definitely is really interesting, right, to look at how even to this day we still have Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Again, they're not called that today anymore, but you do see how that debate about what the role of the federal government should be, how strong the federal government should be, where do states come into play here. That's still something that's still talked about even to this day here. Now, local government is something that isn't really mentioned in this class. That's going to be more for Texas government. But in Texas government, there's a whole chapter on local government, and that's also interesting in terms of how does local government play into the Constitution, and what protections, if any, does local government have. So again, we'll briefly mention it in chapter 3, but Texas government is where we're going to talk more about local government, because there's a whole chapter on local government. So okay, so any questions or comments or anything like that before we leave for today? Anybody else have anything else to add before we end today? I hope today was an interesting discussion here today, and I'm glad that you all were very uh, very that you all participated in our discussion today here in the chat. So yes, awesome. Yes, yes. That's why I like chapter two a lot. It's definitely something that um, there's a lot of political theory to it, and it definitely is very interesting to talk about these different viewpoints and why these people have different viewpoints. Because both sides have make very strong arguments, right? Both sides, we know exactly where they're coming from, right? And it's theory and application, execution. Yes, you're exactly right. Yes, things that are on paper might not necessarily translate the way that it's supposed to, or the way, or the best way, or the most efficient way possibly. Yeah, I mean that pretty much sums up government in general, right? I mean, look at what happened in Austin this past weekend. There's talk about the city manager getting fired because of all the all the horrible winter conditions they had with the trees being frozen and falling, and the power outages, still. I mean, like, and that and I'll just say one more thing. That's not like that wasn't that you don't see those types of those storms you see every year, right? I mean, there's ice up there, there's ice in the Dallas area, that they get snow. So, the 1 2 years ago, that one was one of those, like, I don't want to say once in a lifetime, but that one was definitely not as typical. But this one that we just had, this one was I've seen storms like that before. So I don't know. It's a whole another story. But anyway, it is what it is. So okay, everyone. So we'll go ahead and end for today. Political philosophy is more important than the actual execution. I guess we should always be aiming to perfect our government and how we approach. Let's see. Yes, that is. I mean, I do agree with that as well. That we do need to always be looking to improve, and we always need to be introspective and looking what worked, what didn't work. That's why I hope the people in the Austin government are looking to see, like, hey, what did we do wrong here? We need to look at different things and things like that, because yeah, I mean that's in life in general. I mean, I always try to do that. I always try to look at what I did, what worked, what didn't work. So. Um, but yes, right. I mean, you definitely have to have a plan, going into that, um, and political philosophy is important because you also have to know what your starting point is, right? You also have to know, like, this is what I believe in, this is what I want to accomplish, this is why I believe in this, and so let's try to see what we can do about this, right? So yeah, you definitely have to understand what you believe in and where you're coming from before you try to see if you can try to enact change or enact policy or things like that. You have to definitely understand the logic and the reason behind why you're wanting to make these policy changes and things like that. So I would definitely agree, um, with a lot of that. That yes, that I mean, I do agree that execution is important as well, because you can have philosophy all day, but if it doesn't translate into anything, then it's just going to stay philosophy, right? So how is there, what can we do to actually make it to where the philosophy actually is put into practice? I guess that's kind of what I would finish on that here. Um, but yeah, but you're right. You can't have execution if you don't know where you're going. If you don't have a plan, you don't know where you're going. So okay, everyone, sounds good. Okay, so let's go ahead and end for today, because yeah, I got somebody. I have an appointment with one of my students here. I need to go to my office really quickly. So thankfully, I don't live very far from SCC, so it's just a quick, like, I think I live like a mile away. So, but anyway, everyone. So you all be safe, take care, and so that finishes chapter 2. So we will start chapter 3. We'll see how long. I'm for sure we won't finish it Wednesday. We're gonna have to go into next week. We'll see. Um, Okay, so we'll talk about that on Wednesday. So you all take care, be safe, and we'll see you all on Wednesday, everyone. Thank you all so much, and please email me if you have any questions. Okay, so have a good rest of your day, and enjoy the nice warm weather while it lasts, because it's gonna get cool again in a couple of days. Although not quite as bad as what we had last week. So okay, everyone, sounds good. Take care, be safe, and we'll see you all later. Thank you. You too, Hazel.